view on what's going on with Wellington City Council and if there needs to be a commissioner that's been installed?
Well, I think the first step is the government can put an observer on there. That would be a good start. Clearly they're not making good decisions on behalf of people in Wellington. They decide they want to own an airport, but somehow they can't manage to get all the water that goes out of the dam all the way to people's houses. It seems to leak out on the way.
Have you got any advice to him while he considers said advice?
Look, if I was going to give any advice to Simeon Brown, I'd probably do it privately, but I recognise that for Wellington ratepayers there's a real challenge, and the government sometimes needs to step in. That's not always a silver bullet, as we've seen with the frustrations in Tauranga, but when you've got a council that appears to be making one bad decision after another, sometimes it's time for Parliament that actually gives councils the right to raise rates in the first place, to step in and say we need to do a better job of them.
Isn't this just local democracy in action? Why is a focus on Wellington right now?
Well, we've got to recognise, as I've said, that it's Parliament that passed the Local Government Act that said you could have a council that can send you a rates bill and you have to pay. If they're using that power from Parliament irresponsibly, then it's Parliament's representative, in this case the Minister for Local Government, who's responsible for that law, to step in.
What do you make of the New Zealand First policy that Winston Peters put out the other day around this future fund, saying he wants to not only advance it as policy for the party, but also advance it in this term of government?
Well, I think it's really nothing new. I mean, we know that there's a big problem with infrastructure. The governments are going to have to spend a lot more than $100 billion. A lot of that money, I suspect, will come not just from within New Zealand, but overseas investment. So in all of those areas we're in alignment, but it seems to be things that the government's already doing in a variety of ways.
Minister, is Chris Hipkins doing a good job as Labor leader?
Look, that's up to the Labor caucus, and I hear that they're having a bit to say about that.
Should he remain as leader?
Well, again, you'd have to ask the Labor caucus. I hear they're already talking about
come on,
it.
you can have a bit of a crack. You're a bit more fun than that. Do you think he's...
Look, I think if anyone thinks that another new tax is going to get you back into government, then you should be on a TUI billboard.
Do you believe tax incentives should be used to attract foreign investment?
Look, I think taxes are there to raise revenue. Once you start giving different tax incentives for different activities, you're kind of in Labor territory, like with the fresh fruit and vegetables. I think the job of taxes is to be evenly applied across all activities, so then you can make the decision based on does this business deal stack up, not will I get a tax incentive.
What about when New Zealand is competing against other countries that have tax-free zones and so on for foreign investment, which we need?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that other countries have different tax incentives, but every time they give a tax incentive in one area, they have to charge more tax to other people elsewhere, and at the end of the day, no one's better off. Government's still got to raise its revenue. The question is how complicated it is.
So when Winston Peters comes to you and says, hey, look, this is what I want to do, this term of government, you say, we don't really need to do it.
Well, the government's got a set of coalition agreements, and obviously if we see good ideas, we're happy to build on them. I think basically there needs to be more investment in infrastructure, totally agreed. 100 billion, probably actually more than that. Money needs to come from offshore, agree with that. So, by and large, there's not actually a lot different here from what we're already doing.
So is there any room for a fund like that at all, or do you think not necessarily?
Look, again, the government is already talking about a national infrastructure agency that's going to make sure that we get our building done in the long term, talking about city and regional partnerships with the council. All of this is very important. But I'm actually surprised that there's not more people asking about these prosecution guidelines. They're totally inconsistent with the values of a civilised country where everyone is equal before the law. They're totally inconsistent with this government's commitment to need not race, which is part of coalition commitments. We've raised it with Judith Collins, who says she's all over it, and we look forward to her acting on what seems to be a pretty egregious breach of the foundational principles of this country.
Just back on TUI billboards, I mean, you used one of their billboards in a little meme that you made, and they said, quote,
who are you calling little? Well, it was kind of interesting, wasn't it? Because it was pretty easy when they're picking on easy targets, like, making fun of someone who's gone through court and been acquitted. As soon as you get to a truly difficult issue, like, is the University of Auckland's tilt towards treaty issues while it falls down the international rankings connected, and is compulsory treaty courses next year going to get the University of Auckland back into the top 150, suddenly TUI run for the hills.
Just very quickly on the Manawa Nui, if it costs more to say salvage or remove it than what is available to be paid through insurance, do you think that New Zealand Zealand should front up and pay?
Well, look, I think really that comes down to relationships between governments, particularly the government of Samoa, and I'm not privy to those discussions, but we should be looking to preserve our relationship with the government of Samoa. They're important friends and allies of New Zealand, always have been. Second of all, when it comes to the commercial aspects of what's the environmental damage, how do you clean it up, who pays, there's people that are working on that around the clock, but I'm not really part of that, and I support what people are doing.
Would that be appropriate government spending though?
Well, sometimes, if you send a boat out and something like this happens, you take some responsibilities. Just like if you drive your car on the road and you crash it, you can be liable. We may find that we are responsible and we have to take responsibility. Thank you very much, guys. Cheers.